The crackle of the fire was on the verge of dying down. The embers would bear heat for a long while yet, but they were not trying to cook anything. There would be no pots or pans buried in the dimly glowing coals on this night, and no one would huddle around it as they slept in order to benefit from its fading heat. Everyone lounging around this fire was going to sleep soundly in their beds tonight, in the old house just up the slope. And in the morning someone, most likely Heppenthyle, would cook breakfast as the others rose. It wasn't going to be Calaster. Much like it wasn't going to be Calaster who would throw fresh wood on the fire and stoke it back to life. It was one of the great privileges of seniority, and well-deserved. Even Brasberin was green compared to the old ranger. Not that Brasberin was anything but distinguished and accomplished. Calaster was simply made of different cloth. Old cloth with aching joints, worn down by time, knitted back together by experience. Morave was finishing up the classic story of a daring escape from the maws of a dragon with steel-tipped teeth. Calaster had heard it dozens of times, as had the others. It was a good story, thrilling and full of the kind of subtle embellishment one could identify ranger to ranger, but still enjoy because it never veered into the unbelievable. Unfortunately, the reason Morave never tired of telling this particular story was because it was the only one the rookie had. Barring stealing the stories of others, of course, but Morave, like any good ranger, would never do such a thing. More stories would surely come, but right here, in the company of veterans, Morave often felt insecure. At least that was what Calaster assumed. It was entirely possible for even the most experienced sages to be wrong. "You're quiet tonight." Brasberin pointed at Calaster with a small piece of pine wood before chucking it into the dying fire. "We're all sharing stories. You know the rules." Calaster chortled. "I didn't know there were rules to these little get-togethers, but then my edition of the Ranger's Handbook is an old one." A few reserved chuckles came from around the fire. "Stories, not jokes," Heppenthyle demanded, smiling. "Especially not if they're terrible." "Come now, you've heard every story I have to tell. Jokes are all I have left, and I have never been good at those." "You always say this, but every time you get started, I hear something new," Morave insisted. "That's because you're young. The rest of these distinguished folks here tire of my tales of having crossed the static desert and descended into the depths of the rain caverns." No. I am with Morave on this one. There's always something new." Brasberin disappeared into the shadows to get more firewood from the pile. "There's one thing in particular you've been holding out on us on," said Heppenthyle, pointing toward the old house but meaning a place unimaginably further beyond. "You see, Morave, our dear old friend Calaster here has been to the mountains at the edge." "You did? At the edge? Where the giants live?" Heppenthyle nodded. "And we've heard about none of it." "That's because there's nothing to tell," Calaster protested. "It was no tale of great adventure, nothing that would keep you listening, especially after Morave's daring tale." "Only a handful of rangers have ever been to the mountains at the edge, and even fewer have returned," Morave marveled. "And you say it was no great adventure? Did you see a giant?" "Of course I did. They're hard to overlook. They're giants, after all. My old mentor went to the edge, saw a giant, and barely escaped alive." Brasberin threw in the firewood, then sat back down. "The giant I saw was not like that." "All giants kill rangers. Everyone knows this," Brasberin insisted. "Not this one. No, granted, I only saw the one. That's why the story is so boring." "Did you see it, or did it see you back?" Heppenthyle asked. "Oh, it did. Many times. It was unavoidable. I stayed in its house for a whole winter, and it wasn't one of the short and gentle ones. It all started when, foolishly, I strayed too far into the Blade Plains. The older rangers always used to tell me to be careful. that one could get lost out on that endless expanse. It's difficult to find your bearings when all you can see is those unfathomably gargantuan mountains on the horizon. Even when they loom over you, you're still a week away. But I was young and afraid I wouldn't get to see any of the wonders of the wilds unless I went to seek them out myself. I hadn't learned yet that the wonders would come to me, if I let them. It should go without saying that I also drastically overestimated my own abilities. When the leaves started falling, I thought nothing of it. When sky-darkening fleets of birds began to soar southward, I was so very self-satisfied with the fact that I had caught a straggling duck and was roasting it with some of the spices I still had in my kit. Only when I woke up one night to icy rain pelting into my shelter did I realize winters on the Blade Plains are harsh. Had I tried to make my way back home so late into the year, I would have frozen to death in the middle of nowhere, if I hadn't starved first. The mountains at the edge were the only place I could have gone. At least there I would be safe from the winds. Those can tear you apart as you walk. When I found the cave, my supplies were almost entirely depleted. I had some leathery dry meat and chunks of hard cheese. Berries had become the subject of my dreams. Even after months of having the mountains at the actual edge of my vision, I was not prepared for their immensity. I could lie down to look at the roof of the cavern entrance, and even then it gave me vertigo. But there could have been no better shelter from the elements. After a few hours of delving deeper, I found that it was even warm. Every ranger knows this, of course, I just struggled to believe it. Light wasn't an issue either. Even when the shine from the entrance dimmed and I entered much grander caverns, they had holes farther up the mountains. But it was getting late. The sun had already set outside. I sheltered in a small crevice that seemed almost made for me, and slept more comfortably than I had in weeks. When I woke up in the morning, it took me longer than I cared to admit to realize where I was. You see, I was convinced that I had entered a cave, and yet what I saw in the bright morning light was clearly outside. A forest, beautiful as I ever saw one. Moss and mushrooms, vines and foliage, draped over the giant pillars, plateaus, and stalagmites of this endless cavern I could barely make out the other side of. There were even a few trees in spots where the sunlight reached direct. They seemed ancient and majestic in one moment, yet diminutive as matchsticks the next, as my mind tried to place them in the context of the cavern. Fish splashed about in countless little ponds. Some of them, had I seen them anywhere else, would have seemed like lakes to me. There were also animals, some of which I knew, like rats and boars and deer, thrushes, wrens, and dippers nesting higher in the rugged rock faces than the goats could climb. There were stranger critters, too. Things from deeper inside the mountain, most of them blind, but not, as I would discover, without senses. Groups of pensive-looking crawlers shaped like teardrops, red fur sticking out between the cracks of large plates of shell that covered their bodies. Many-beaked sticks stalking about on willowy legs, letting lures into the ponds. Spring-shaped, bouncy little things that tasted absolutely terrible. I am telling you, the worst cut of meat I ever had in my life, if indeed meat is what they were made out of. I felt sick for days. There were predators too. Bears, large cats, a pack of wolves somewhere. We kept out of each other's way. There was enough for everyone in this cavern, and it was only the first in a vast system. Traversing this one alone took more than a day, with its terrain. It took me several weeks to even encounter the giant. In an adjacent chamber, if one can use that word, which I discovered almost by accident, everything looked rather different, and I couldn't even put my finger on how at first. Certainly it was darker, though not in a sinister way, and thus it followed that there would be less vegetation. But there was a bit too little. No trees or vines, only mosses. The intricate rock formations found in the antecedent cavern were replicated nowhere. On the ground there was only rubble and a solitary stream of water. The walls, it seemed, were carved, mostly smoothed, just like the ceiling far above. The realization of what this might mean dawned on me just when the giant rounded the corner from an entirely different cavern. I struggle to describe it at all, not just because it looked strange, which it did. The few words that I could use, because the giant seemed to have some vague semblance of this or that, just don't fit. They're too small to describe a being of such immensity. I'd say it was big or large or huge, but no sound in our language meant for describing size is enough. Giants may be smaller than the mountains they live in, but they move and live and breathe. That somehow makes them larger. I was lucky that day. I saw the giant, but the giant didn't see me. In my entire life, I wasn't so terrified. It could have crushed my body into pulp without even trying. Rangers that come back from the mountains at the edge after having seen their friends destroyed by a giant are changed beyond recognition. We all know the stories, the cautionary tales. I resolved to go back to my cabin. Funny, I should think of it as mine, or as safe. It was larger than many a forest, but at least the giant wasn't there. I could winter in the countless hiding spots. Even if the giant did come through, it'd be none the wiser. Or so I thought. What I didn't expect was that, for all their size, giants can be stealthy. I was pulling up fish traps on the shore of the largest lake in my cabin. The water had cooled significantly since my arrival, and most of the fish had retreated through whatever cracks and fissures they used to go from pond to pond, and far beyond. A sudden blaze of light made me freeze up in terror. The giant was right there, a lantern the size of the sun in its hand. I was half an hour's hike away from it, yet it was only a single step away from me. And it was looking at me. You'll talk to many rangers. They'll say the giants do not have faces. I assure you that they do. And this one was looking right at me. The single fish I'd actually caught slipped out and away from me. It was the least of my concerns. As the giant glared down at me, I was sure I was done for. All I asked was that death come quickly. But it didn't. Instead, the moment lasted an eternity. I wouldn't dare guess what made the giant decide not to squash me right there. All I know is that it didn't. It just stared down at me with that peculiar lantern. And then it left. Sauntered out of the cave through the same opening I had used, like nothing had happened. But it had seen me, looked right at me, and lingered. When the giant returned several days later, I was prepared. By which I mean I had found many great places to hide. Little corners so tiny that the giant would never think to look in them. And it didn't. Though not for a lack of trying. In its furor, it toppled columns, ripped out trees, spilled entire lakes. It swatted a whole flock of birds to death almost casually when they tried to defend their nests on a little plateau the giant was chucking boulders onto. I was lucky. It never even looked close to my hiding spot, which was part of the reason why I felt confident enough to do what I did later. Unfortunately, winter ended up creeping into that idyllic cavern after a few weeks. I tried to stay put for as long as possible, but blizzards started whipping into the little grotto I was sheltering in most nights. Many of the animals ventured deeper, and if I was to survive, I knew I would have to do the same. Even with so much of the wildlife migrated, the place was even stranger than I remembered. Every pattern in the rock, every shape in the stone, it all seemed unreal somehow. Still, the house of the giant was unmistakably a cave. A cave shaped by the giant to suit its unscrutable preferences, but a cave nonetheless. At this point in my life, I had not been to the rain caverns yet, but I knew how to survive in a place like this, even if the pickings were somewhat more sparse than they had been. It was, after all, winter, and winter is not kind to the persnickety. So I found my shelter, a rather spacious, mostly horizontal cleft I could easily climb into without being seen. The ground was a bit uncomfortable, but I could set up my tent there and store supplies outside of it without having to worry about them being damaged by the elements. The rats were a different problem, but they were rarely able to make the climb, so I had to deal with them only on occasion. It did get a little worse once I started leaving my ropes, picks, and carabiners on the cliff face. It was perhaps a bit heedless of me, as the giant could have seen them and guessed at my hiding spot, but it never seemed to. It was simply too convenient not to leave the climbing route set up. In fact, it saved me once, when the giant entered the cavern unexpectedly while I was out. If I'd had to set up for a climb, it would have certainly spotted me. Only a few weeks later did it dawn on me that perhaps it had. Because it saw me then. It certainly did. It was one of those rare occasions where it was traveling without its unspeakable sun lantern. I was wholly unprepared, lying in ambush for a lone caribou I'd seen wandering about. The giant almost crushed me then, but at the last moment seemed to change its mind. While I was convinced that I was, in fact, dead, the giant stared down at me for what, once again, seemed like another eternity. This time I was the first to move. I don't know what I was thinking as I ran away, directly and without subterfuge, to my encampment. It feels ridiculous to say so, but the giant did not give chase. Whatever chase might have meant. I grew bolder after that. Well, at least I did later. The next few days I remained terrified, shaken to my core yet again. It was only when I woke up one day to find the giant staring directly at my tent, having lowered itself specifically to peer into the cleft I was living in, that I understood just how much I was at the mercy of this creature, and how much it had been that way from the very beginning. Contrary to everything I had been taught, the giant did not want to kill me. And quite frankly, after its initial curiosity at having a ranger squatting in its home, it felt as though it grew disinterested in me entirely. It would occasionally destroy some traps I was setting, and when I set up my climbing gear in a more obvious spot, it swiped that away also, just to show me that I was still a guest in its house. Ultimately, I learned to keep out of sight, and aside from that instinctive terror one feels in the presence of anything far beyond one's own power as a giant, I became unafraid of my host. It was difficult to track the time so deep in the house of the giant. There were days where I felt as though I was going mad, usually after I returned from one of my short expeditions to the great cave mouth I had entered through. The simple truth was that this winter ended up being a long one. I'm certain the giant would not have minded if I had stuck around in its cave, but I had no intention of staying. When spring was finally there, I loaded up the supplies I'd stocked up hunting this rich and comfortable winter and made my way back across the Blade Plains. Though I mounted many an expedition over the years, I never returned to the mountains at the edge. I knew that, in that one winter, I had seen as much of that place as I would ever care to see. Besides, I did not want to run the risk of being crushed by a giant. It would ruin my memory of the polite titan that took me in over those frigid months.